Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, classmates. Introduction of the coming of the United States. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on the Spain following the sinking of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898. The war ended with the signing of Treaty Parish on December 10, 1898. As a result, Spain lost its control over and remain of its overseas empire, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippine Islands, Guam, and other islands. Beginning in 1492, Spain was the first European nation to sail westward across the Atlantic Ocean, explore and colonize the Amerindian nations of the Western Hemisphere. At its greatest extent, the empire that resulted from this exploration extended from Virginia on the eastern coast of the United States south to the Tierra del Fuego at the tip of South America including Brazil, and westward to California and Alaska. Across the Pacific, it included the Philippines and other islands group. By 1825, much of this empire had fallen into other hands, and in that year, Spain acknowledged the independence of its possessions in the present-day United States, then under the Mexican control, and the south to the tip of South America. The only remnants that remained in the empire in the Western Hemisphere were Cuba and Puerto Rico, and across the Pacific in the Philippine Islands and the Carolina, Marshall, and Mariana Island, including Guam in Micronesia. Cuba. Following the liberation of Spain from mainland Latin America, Cuba was the first to initiate its own struggle for independence. During the years from 1868 to 1878, Cubans personified by guerrilla fighter known as Mambis fought for autonomy from Spain. That war concluded with a treaty that was never enforced. In the 1890s, Cubans began to agitate once again for their freedom from Spain. The moral leader of this struggle was Jose Marti, known as El Apostol, who established the Cuban Revolutionary Party on January 5, 1892 in the United States. Following the Grito del Ber, the call to arms on February 24, 1895, Marti returned to Cuba and participated in the first weeks for armed struggle when he was killed on May 19, 1895. The Philippines Island. The Philippines was beginning to grow and strive with Spanish rule. Jose Rizal, a member of a wealthy mestizo family, resented that his upper mobility was limited by Spanish insistence on promoting only pure-blooded Spaniards. He began his political career at the University of Madrid in 1882, where he became the leader of Filipino students there. For the next 10 years, he travels in Europe and wrote several novels considered seditious by Filipino and church authorities. He returned to Manila in 1892 and founded the La Liga Filipina, a political group dedicated to peaceful change. He was rapidly exiled to Mindanao. During his absence, Andres Bonifacio founded Katipunan, dedicated to the violent overthrow of the Spanish rule. On August 26, 1896, after learning that the Katipunan had been betrayed, Bonifacio issued the Decreto de Balintawak, a call for Filipino to revolt. Bonifacio was succeeded as head of the Philippines Revolution by Emilio Aguinaldo y Farme, who had his predecessors arrested and executed on May 10, 1897. Aguinaldo negotiated a deal with the Spaniard who exiled him to Hong Kong with 400,000 pesos that he subsequently used to buy weapons to resume the fighters. Puerto Rico. During the 1880s and 1890s, Puerto Ricans developed many different political parties, some of which sought independence for the islands while others, headquarters like their Cuban counterparts in New York, prepared to ally with the United States. Spain proclaimed the autonomy of Puerto Rico on November 25, 1897. Although the news did not reach the islands until January 1898 and a new government established on February 12, 1898. United States. U.S. interest in purchasing Cuba had become long before 1898. Following the 10 Years' War, American sugar interests bought up large tracts of land in Cuba. Alteration in U.S. sugar tariff favoring homegrown beet sugar helped foment the rekindling of revolutionary fervor in 1895. By that time, the U.S. had more than 50 million invested in Cuba, and annual trade, mostly in sugar, was twice that much. Fervor for war had been growing in the United States, despite President Grover Cleveland's proclaim of neutrality on June 12, 1895. But sentiment to enter the conflict grew in the United States when General Venancio Wiley began implementing a policy of reconquistions that moved the population into central locations guarded by Spain's troops and placed the entire country under martial law in February 1896. By December 7, President Cleveland revested himself, declaring that the United States might be intervened should Spain fail to end crisis in Cuba. President William McKinley, inaugurated on March 4, 1897, was even more anxious to become involved, particularly after the New York Journal published a copy of a letter from Spanish Foreign Minister Enrique Duque de Lorme, criticizing the American president on February 9, 1898. Events moved swiftly after the explosion aboard the USS Maine on February 15. On March 9, Congress passed a law allocating $50 million to build up military strength. On March 28, the U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry finds that a Maine blew off the Maine. On April 21, President McKinley orders a blockade of Cuba, and 4 days later, the U.S. declares war. The war, following its declaration of war against Spain issued on April 25, 1898, the United States added the Taylor Amendments, asserting that it could not be attempted to exercise hegemony over Cuba. 2 days later, Commander George Dewey sailed from Hong Kong with Emilio Aguinaldo on board. Fighting began in the Philippine Islands at the Battle of Manila Bay on May 1, where Commander George Dewey reportedly reclaimed, "You may fire when ready, Gridley," and the Spanish fleet under Rear Admiral Patricio Montojo was destroyed. However, Dewey did not enough manpower to capture Manila, so Aguinaldo's reguillas maintained their operations until 15,000 U.S. troops arrived at the end of July. On the way, the cruiser Charleston stopped at Guam and accepted its surrender from its Spanish governor, who was unaware his nation was at war. Although a peace protocol was signed by the two belligerents on August 12, Commander Dewey and March General Wesley Merritt, leader of the Army troop, assaulted Manila the very next day, unaware that peace had been declared. In late April, Andrew Summers Rowan made contact with Cuban General Calixto Garcia, who supplied him with maps, intelligence, and a corps of rebels officers to coordinate U.S. efforts on the islands. The U.S. North Atlantic Squadron left Key West for Cuba on April 22, following the frightening news that Spanish home fleet commanded by Admiral Pascual Cervera had felt Cadiz and entered Santiago, having shipped by U.S. ships commanded by William T. Sampsons and Winfield Scott Shaley. They arrived in Cuba in late May. War actually began for the U.S. in Cuba on June, when the Marines captured Guantanamo Bay and 17,000 troops landed at Siboney and Daiquiri, east of Santiago de Cuba, the second largest city of the island. At that time, Spanish troops stationed on the islands include 150,000 regulars and 40,000 irregulars, and volunteers who are rebels inside Cuba number as many as 50,000. Total U.S. Army strength at that time totaled 26,000, requiring the passage of the Mobilization Act of April 22 that allowed for any army of at first 125,000 volunteers, later increased to 200,000, and a regular army of 65,000. On June 22, U.S. troops landed the Daiquiri, where they were joined by Calixto Garcia and about 5,000 revolutionaries. U.S. troops attacked the San Juan Heights on July 1, 1898. These mounted troopers, including the African American 19th and the 10th Cavalries and the Rough Riders, commanded by Lieutenant Corporal Theodore Roosevelt, went up against Kettle Hills, while the forces led by Brigadier General Jacob Kent charged up San Juan Hill and pushed Spanish troops further inland while inflicting 1,700 casualties. While U.S. commanders were deciding a further course of action, Admiral Cervera left port only to be defeated by Shinley. On July 16, the Spaniards agreed to the unconditional surrender of the 23,500 troops around the city. A few days later, Major General Nelson Miles sailed from Guantanamo to Puerto Rico. His forces landed near Ponce and marched to San Juan with virtually no opposition. Representatives of Spain and the United States signed a peace treaty in Paris on December 10, 1898, which established the independence of Cuba, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and allowed the victorious power to purchase the Philippines island from Spain for $200 million. The war had cost the United States $250 million and 3,000 lives, of whom 90% had perished from infectious diseases. The summary of the coming of the United States. April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. On February 15, 1898, the sinking of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. December 10, 1898, the war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. 1492, Spain was the first European nation to sail westward across the Atlantic Ocean, explore and colonize the Amerindian nations of the Western Hemisphere. By 1825, much of this empire had fallen into other hands, and in that year Spain acknowledged the independence of its possessions in present-day United States, then under Mexican control, and south to the tip of South America. Cuba was the first to initiate its own struggle for independence during the years from 1868 to 1878. Cubans, personified by guerrilla fighters known as Mambis, fought for autonomy from Spain. In 1890s, Cubans began to agitate once again for their freedom from Spain. Jose Marti, known as El Apostol, who established the Cuban Revolutionary Party on January 5, 1892 in the United States. February 24, 1895, following the Grito de Barre, the call to arms. On May 19, 1895, Marti returned to Cuba and participated in the first weeks of armed struggle when she was killed. Jose Rizal, a member of wealthy mestizo family, resented that his upper mobility was limited by Spanish insistence for promoting only pure-blooded Spaniards. In 1882, Jose Rizal began his political career at the University of Madrid. In 1892, Jose Rizal returned to Manila and founded the La Liga Filipina, a political group dedicated to peaceful change. During his absence, Andres Bonifacio founded Katipunan, dedicated to the violent overthrow of Spanish rule. August 26, 1896, learning that the Katipunan had been betrayed, Bonifacio issued the Decreto de Balintawak, a call for Filipino revolt. May 10, 1897, Bonifacio was succeeded as head of the Philippine Revolution by Emilio Aguinaldo y Fami, who had his predecessor arrested and executed. Aguinaldo negotiated a deal with the Spaniards who exiled him to Hong Kong with 400,000 pesos that he subsequently used to buy weapons to resume the fight. During the 80s and 90s, Puerto Ricans developed many different political parties, some of which sought independence for the islands while others, headquartered like their Cuban counterparts in Europe, preferred to ally with the United States. Spain proclaimed the autonomy of Puerto Rico on November 25, 1897, although the news did not reach the islands until January 1898, and a new government established on February 12, 1898. 1898, the United States interest in Pershing Cuba had begun. 1895, alterations in U.S. sugar tariff favoring homegrown beet sugar helped foment the rekindling of revolutionary fervor. June 12, 1895, President Grover Cleveland's proclaim of neutrality. February 1896, General Valenciano Whaley began implementing a policy of recon creation that moved the population into general locations guarded by Spanish troops and placed the inter-country under martial law. By December 7, President Cleveland reversed himself, declaring the United States might intervene should Spain fail to the end of crisis in Cuba. President William McKinley inaugurated on March 4, 1897, was even more anxious to become involved, particularly after the New York Journal published a copy of a letter from Spanish Foreign Minister Enrique Dupay de Lome, criticizing the American president on February 9, 1898. Events moved swiftly after the explosion aboard the USS Maine on February 15. On March 9, Congress passed a law allocating $50 million to build up military strength. On March 28, the U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry finds that a Maine blew up the Maine. On April 21, President McKinley orders a blockade of Cuba, and 4 days later, the U.S. declares war. Following its declaration of war against Spain issued on April 25, 1898. The United States added a Taylor Amendment asserting that it could not be attempt to exercise hegemony over Cuba. 2 days later, Commander George Dewey sailed from Hong Kong with Emilio Aguinaldo on board. Fighting began in the Philippine Islands at the Battle of Manila Bay on May 1, where Commander George Dewey reported a claim, "You may fire when ready, Gridley," and the Spanish fleet under Rear Admiral Patricio Montojo was destroyed. August 12, Commander Dewey and Marge Gen Wesley Merritt, leader of the army troops, assaulted Manila the very next day, unaware that peace had been declared. In late April, Andrew Summer Roman made contact with Cuban General Calixto Garcia, who supplied him maps, intelligence, and a corps of rebel officers to coordinate U.S. efforts on the islands. The U.S. North Atlantic Squadron left Key West for Cuba on April 22, following the fighting news at the Spanish home fleet commander by Admiral Pascual Cervera had left Cadiz and entered Santiago, having slipped by U.S. ships commanded by William T. Sampson and Winfield Scott Slee. They arrived in Cuba in late May. July 1, 1898, U.S. troops attacked the San Juan Heights. These mounted troopers, including the African American 19th and 10th Cavaliers and the Rough Riders commanded by Lieutenant Corporal Theodore Roosevelt, went up against Kettle Hill, while the forces led by Brigadier General Jacob Kent charged up San Juan Hill and pushes Spanish troops further inland while inflicting 1,700 casualties. On July 16, the Spaniards agreed to the unconditional surrender of the 23,500 troops around the city. A few days later, Major General Nelson Miles sailed from Guantánamo and to Puerto Rico. His forces landed near Ponce and marched to San Juan with virtual no opposition. Representatives of Spain and the United States signed a peace treaty in Paris on December 10, 1898. Thank you for listening and God bless you.